Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Level Agency's Test Learn Grow podcast. I'm your host for today, Dale Reether, Digital Marketing Lead here at Level. Today, I have the honor of being joined by our very own Jeff Roebuck, Team Lead, and Jenna Bludorn, Senior Account Director, who work together to lead the charge on one of our higher education marketing teams here at the agency. When we sat down together earlier in the year and asked ourselves, what are some of the top things that our higher ed clients are focused on right now? Being able to effectively nurture leads into students was very high on that list. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And with that, I will welcome in Jeff and Jenna. How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the podcast.
It's going great. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Let's dive right into it. Whenever we talk about lead nurturing, in your mind, what are we really saying here? Because I think a lot of the time, whenever we say lead nurturing, and from my experience, people automatically get their mindset into automated email, which I know isn't the whole picture. But in your mind, what are we actually saying here whenever we say lead nurturing?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that a little bit. I think you're right. People think lead nurturing and it's let's make some email drip campaigns. Maybe we send 4 emails, we send them a week apart, a couple days apart, and we just call it a day, see what the open rate was and measure. Lead nurturing can mean so much more than every vertical, but especially in higher education. If you're not nurturing your leads with a multi-channel approach that includes a lot of things we're going to talk about today, from email to text to push notification to paid search to paid social and everything in between, then you're missing out on leads that you already have. And therefore, you're really decreasing the amount of students that you're going to have butts in seats, as we like to say in education. So you already have these leads, whether they're new leads, they're age leads, they're somewhere in between. And if you're not capitalizing on that, then you're just kind of letting all of the money that you spent to get those leads go to waste. So the biggest portion of lead nurturing is really understanding what you already have before you start to think about tactics. So Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about like the audiences and how we can kind of dive into those before we talk tactics?
Yeah, first, Jenna, thank you for saying the phrase butts and seats so the preview can have your face associated with that subtitle instead of mine.
You're welcome.
And before I start talking about audiences, I just want to sort of scale or give a sense of scale of what we're talking about and how important lead nurturing is. When we talk about diversifying and making sure that you're meeting them where they are, not just in email, not just in phone calls or SMS texting. We implemented a wide variety of digital marketing initiatives beyond those things to one university who had a top tier, high quality call center email strategy with, program specific drip campaigns and dynamic emails. And we pushed creative, we targeted the right people in social and display, and doing that in conjunction with email and everything else that they were doing, raised enroll rates by 60%. Imagine if you could do something and get 60% more business. Imagine if you could do anything and get 60% more business. That's what we're talking about. Now, I'm not promising that, obviously. I'm not 60% rise in enrollment rate guarantee. It's not what I'm doing here. But that's what we're talking about. It can be very impactful. And the audiences are small. So the audiences are just the leads you have. And you can segment them. If you have enough, segment them by program, segment them by campus. If you have different campuses, segment them by need. So when I talk about campus and program, like somebody going to a campus in Florida is going to have very different needs than somebody going to a campus in Colorado, right? But also if they have different needs, financial aid considerations, things that people are talking about, break out your audiences in that way. But if you've got 15,000, 20,000, 5,000 leads, you're only advertising to those people. Now your CPMs are going to be high, but it's going to be super cheap because these audiences are hyper narrow and you know exactly the kind of messaging to send to them because you have all the information already. So imagine if your prospecting efforts were like that. You knew exactly what your prospects needed 100%, and you knew you were targeting the right people 100% of the time. That's what this is doing. That's what nurturing is doing. And it's such a tiny audience. The costs are really effective and the messaging is really effective because you're hitting them exactly where you know they need to be.
And you can get even more specific than that, right? Too, like you can do campus and program, but you can also do the time length that they were involved with the admissions process. So if somebody who just came in is going to need different messaging than someone who's been sitting. And one thing that we found is that we shouldn't discount leads that have been sitting for more than a week, 2 weeks, even 90 days, a year. Now, these longer term campaigns are going to look so different than anything for new lead nurturing. But it's something where we already have this valuable asset of all of these leads that are just sitting around. We may as well use them. Now, the tactics are going to be different. The messaging strategy is going to be different, but the outcome won't. And so like what Jeff is talking about, segmentation is key. We don't want to over segment. I will caution on that one point. Like you need to have lists that are large enough to serve if you're using digital. And then from an email strategy, you need to have, or text strategy, you need to have a list that's large enough to make a measurable impact. You need to be able to say that this lift actually did something. And so we'll talk about measurement strategies, but don't get too caught up in segmentation for your audience when you start, but try to make meaningful groups that have a significant enough size to be able to measure against.
I think that's a really good call out on overly segmenting, because it can look really good on paper, right? Like we're going to take all these, let's say 10 different segments that all downloaded a different piece of content or something, or within a certain stage of the enrollment process. And you're like, wow, we're going to be able to hit them with the exact right messaging at their exact right time. And then you do it and you're like, oh shit, there's 15 people in this audience. We can't actually do
not doing anything. Yeah.
You can do that in email. You can't do it. You can't do it in other spots. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah.
I also just, she talked about creative, and I won't get too deep into that because I'm sure we'll talk about it. But the way that you target them is going to be based on the information you have. But the messaging strategy that you have is also going to depend on what their needs are, and those needs are going to be different by how you segment them. They're also going to be different by like your institution, your university, your college, because like their needs and what they need for the next stage is going to depend on what you're already giving them and what you're already focusing on. And maybe they don't need financial aid information because you've already given that to them 5 different times, right? So maybe you need to change the messaging. So, and obviously all of these things that we're going to say, we're going to try to be as general as possible. So it applies to you as much as possible, but you're going to obviously need to tailor all of these things to your own institutions. Challenges and successes, and maximize your strengths and tackle those barriers that you usually face when people are calling prospects on the phone or when you're emailing folks.
Yeah, that's true, Jeff. I think it's important too to draw a line between segmentation, what we were just talking about, and personalization, because segmentation and personalization are two completely different things. So you need an appropriately segmented audience, right? But we need to know who these people are. They need to be a large enough list, but they need to be specific enough to be meaningful and to work across different platforms and channels. But then personalization is where that creative comes into play. And that's where that messaging concept, like you're saying, comes into play, but also where AI can come into play. I know we talk a lot about AI on the podcast. We talk a lot about ChatGPT and a million other different platforms, but there are so many different tools that we can use today to personalize messages more than ever before. And that means I don't have to overly segment my audience because I'm personalizing my messages, sometimes using smarter tools like AI, but also just using some basic copywriting techniques to really get at the pain points of these people. Then we can also use things like dynamic insertion to make things more personalized, and we could use personalized video and a million other tools. But for lack of we don't want to get into every single tactic, but that personalization is going to be a really important part no matter what tactic you're using.
Definitely. So as you can see, just from the first 10 minutes of this podcast, nurturing is much more than just email. And the way that I try to think of it is like, it's a stage in the customer journey, right? Like it's your opportunity to impact the consideration decision phase because people are already engaged with the brand and you have information on them to figure out how to influence a decision, which is all the things that you guys just described, right? Personalization, segmentation, how they interacted with you, what information do we have that we can get in a re-engagement strategy to continue to push them through the student journey. So we started to get into tactics a little bit. I know that there is an endless list of tactics that you can possibly do, but at a base level, right? For someone who's listening to this and they're like, damn, we really are just doing automated email and some like automated text, maybe not even text message. So, but what should they be doing? What should they be testing into first at a very basic level?
Yes, I think you want to think of it as an ecosystem, and you want to evaluate the strength and the completeness of your ecosystem as you add in different parts. So if you're only doing email right now, maybe let's add in something that is similar to email, but augments it through text message. And so then we've created a little bit more of an ecosystem. It's two different tactics that kind of create that. We're trying to create a type of journey or bubble around our potential student or our user. And so when we're adding in text, we're reaching them in one more place. And then once we have that in, whether we're using a CRM or an automation platform, whatever it is, once we have that built out, it's all working together, it's passing data back and forth, we're able to report out on it holistically. Then let's add in one more thing. Maybe let's add in some display so that that gets filtered into that journey. And it's another great touch point, and we can even more accurately report on the entire nurturing ecosystem, not just email, and how we're lifting students overall. Then if display is working great, let's add in some social. Social is a little bit more complicated. We have more creative need, we have more assets, we have more campaign building, budget management, regular campaign optimization. We can actually then start to do a real lift test. So let's add social in, we'll have display, we'll have text, we'll have email, and then you have a pretty complete ecosystem. And then you can start to really experiment with more tactics. You can add in some push notifications if you wanted to test something new. You could add in personalized video if you wanted to, where it's actually seeming like you're reaching out to a student one-on-one. What you're doing is trying to build a really solid base and then just adding different testing elements on top of there. So if you only have email, that's no problem. Let's just add one more thing in and let's test in between it. If that's enough for you and that's doing a crazy lift, let's stay there until we're seeing the point of diminishing returns. It doesn't have to be a 6-tactic suite right off the bat. It can be 2 things, and that can be plenty for your audience because we're communicating with them in different ways that we weren't before.
Definitely. And I imagine like you kind of laid it out in 3 to 4 steps there, like maybe just test into some text message, maybe move into display. Then you mentioned social. I imagine that has some nuance there too, depending on what kind of school you are. And that also brings it back to the segmentation piece before, right? So what are some things that schools should be considering whenever they're trying to, because we say social, there's a lot of social platforms. How should you be thinking about which social platforms might be right for you?
There's like you said, it can depend on the institution, the programs you have. If you have primarily doctorate programs you're focusing on, the program of choice is probably going to be a little bit different than if you're doing associates only or trades programs but we can go into stereotypes and that sort of thing. But I think the most valuable for me, if you're lucky enough to be present on a lot of social platforms, is to see where your potential audience is already engaging with you. So if you have really great engagement on TikTok, but not so much on the meta platforms, then maybe you focus on TikTok content or Snapchat or whatever it is. I mean, don't discount the other platforms, but if you had to pick and choose a budget or what you focus creatively on, then take a look at what social program or what social platforms you're already getting really positive, either organic or paid engagement from, and go from there. That would be my starting point to make that determination.
Yeah. You want to use your existing, like Jeff is saying, like that's an awesome idea because you were familiar with it. But then you also want to just make sure you have a really strong hypothesis. We're saying, social, specifically meta, is going to impact retention, and this is how we're going to do it, or impact overall volume lift. And so we're gonna do a formal experiment, and we're gonna advertise against a group of people, and we're not gonna advertise against the rest, and we're gonna see which ones convert more of leads that we already have. And so you're using that platform as a tool, but your hypothesis is guiding you. And so you're not just randomly adding tactics and tools into the mix. You're thinking, all right, first I want to see how this population reacts. Like Jeff saying, the population already lives in this platform, so let's optimize on that, and then let's have a hypothesis that guides us through the measurement.
I think it's a good segue into the measurement piece. How do you tell it's working?
You have more students.
I mean, like if the goal is to get more students or get more enrolls or whatever measurement strategy you would normally use for, is my admissions team doing the right kind of job? use the same kind of measurement strategy for this. The difficult part for what most institutions use, at least in my experience, what most institutions use is they use like a last click measurement strategy. So if I got a lead from paid search and they become a student, they're always going to be credited with paid search, even though email touched them, even though I called them, right? My calls don't get credit, paid search gets credit. And that's what makes sense, because that's what I'm trying, my marketing, my prospective marketing is what's trying to drive it. And you also don't want to rely on direct interaction and engagement, because a lot of times our goals for these things aren't become a lead because they're already a lead. Why would they fill out another lead form? Doesn't make any sense. I don't have a compelling reason to do that. So, I mean, the content, the call to action is all different. So how do I measure that? And it's really about classic scientific method of control and experiment. So the way that we've found the most success is you have your list. Let's say we have 50,000 or 50,000 leads that we want to work, right? And we say, okay, some percentage, let's say 50-50. 25,000 of them are going to be set in my control group, and I'm going to randomize it, but 25,000 of them are just set aside. They're never going to get advertisement. That's my control. And then my experiment is over here, another 25,000 students. And I'm going to take that list physically, it gets hashed and all of that stuff, but it goes into Meta, it goes into GDN, it goes into wherever you're putting it, right? And then you advertise that experiment. Maybe you even go so far as to say, okay, the control list, I'm going to actively negate from my advertising just in case, right? Make sure your targeting is clean. And then you measure the impact of, okay, what did the leads and the experiment do? What did the leads and the control do? And if they're different, you can say, well, they were completely randomized. So the only major difference that I can measure is that we showed them advertising in this platform, or we nurtured them in a different way. And that's why we see the lift, right? So that's how we get the figure of, if we did advertising in Meta and GDN against these leads, their enroll rates increased 60%, because the experiment was 60% more likely to become an enroll than the control. You set your time frame. So I'd recommend at least a couple months. You're not going to learn anything significant in 2 weeks, unless you are e-com or something like that, where the turn rate for these things to a sale are like a day. But because you have a natural maturation cycle from when a lead comes in versus when they actually enroll, you want to make sure you give these lists enough time to actually have an impact. And you measure and you monitor and you optimize, and then you see, okay, after 3 months, let's say 3 months, right? After 3 months, what did the experiment do? And that's how I know it worked. And then we say, okay, it works. Let's do it for all of the leads, and we know it's going to continue to work. And then you optimize towards engagement and those sorts of things. But ultimately, it's about control, experiment. How did the experiment do at the same time? And then that's how you're going to learn how effective your efforts are.
And one metric too that I think gets forgotten sometimes is time to convert. I think nurturing can really help with that. If you have a time to convert that's really long, especially if it's in higher education, it's a really big investment, right? We're asking students to do a lot. They're giving a lot of money or asking for a lot of financial aid. They're changing their future. This is not just to purchase a product. This is to change their lives. And so we can't lose track of the sight of what higher ed's trying to do. But we know that time to convert is really important, because we need to be able to set specific classes. We need to be able to understand what the financial model is along the way. So we can look at time to convert as an indicator as well. So the experiment that Jeff's talking about is the core of nurturing measurement. We have to be doing that. But if we're looking at, if we add in nurturing touch points along the way, is a student more likely to convert in 2 weeks instead of in 4 weeks? That would be a really awesome thing to be able to tell. And then there's going to be a point of diminishing return on those touch points, because we don't want to be the ever-present, always there voice in the back of the student's head. We just want to be guiding them along the journey. So it's going to take some testing. It's going to take some learning to get there. But you're able to look at a lot of different directional measurements as well as your core lit test to tell how your program is working.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Talking about that in B2B a lot too, like leading indicators of success. The time to conversion reminds me of looking at time to close for B2B companies, but ultimately the goal is revenue, and the same goes for here. The ultimate goal is more students. And then, Jeff, I know we talked a little bit about the measurement piece during a previous episode where we were talking about lift from awareness efforts. And I know you mentioned if you don't want to go to market and completely exclude 50% of a certain audience, I know you've also talked like if you have multiple campus locations, that is an option too. I'm trying to remember, is there anything else from that episode in terms of like methods for measuring outside of pull out tests that we talked about?
Yeah, I mean, you can do a geo split, but the concern I would have with the geo split in this particular test is because it's such a niche audience and their needs are so different. If you're splitting Colorado with Florida, it could be your results could be that the experiment got the experiment treatment, so got nurturing versus control, but it could also be that Florida's prospects are just different than Colorado prospects, right? So you just run the risk of if it's not a truly randomized split, you run into the risk that there's a third, a tertiary variable impacting the results. And that's why you do statistical analysis and those sorts of things to try to determine what the impact of things that are outside of your control are having. But if you do a truly random split, then you can minimize quite a bit of that. And the reason that it's so strong in nurturing versus awareness is we can actually effectively measure who is in the experiment randomized versus the control. You could try, like in awareness, you could try to limit your audience to only a 50% impression share, but it would be near impossible to measure, okay, who of my leads actually saw a display ad versus didn't, especially in this more and more cookieless world. You could probably do that pretty effectively 5 years ago, but no longer do you have that many great advanced systems that can reliably do that, as much as Meta may want you to believe otherwise. So that would be sort of my recommendation. You can do lift studies, but that's really about an awareness strategy. There's also some CRMs like Salesforce have great attribution systems that say like, this audience member, this lead is in this category of lead types. And so like, how many touch points did they get based off of the emails you're sending through Salesforce? So those systems can be really powerful as well. But I think the simplest and probably best, strongest statistical story you're going to be able to tell is that control and experiment split.
And it doesn't have to be scary. I know some clients will come to us and say, but if we're not advertising to 50% of them and they're not converting, then they're just getting left there. We don't want to neglect the 50% that aren't getting the treatment. They're still getting the normal admissions process. It doesn't always have to be 50%. It needs to be substantial. So we're not going to do a 10 and 90% split, but we could probably argue for a 60-40 or maybe even a 70-30, just depending. But we need to be able to give them enough time to actually make the meaningful decision. And I know it can be so hard when you're thinking it like you're an admissions director or you're a campus director and you're like, I just need more students. I have all these leads that are sitting here. Let's just advertise to all of them. I totally understand that instinct because you just have this resource. The problem with that is, and you're just never going to know what the actual impact was, and you're not going to be able to iterate off of that. So we can't just blast them all again because that's not going to work. So I understand how hard it can be, but I also know how important the patience is in making sure we have a true experiment, we have a true holdout group. And then for the media people listening to this, it's really important that we keep those lists clean. I can't emphasize enough how important it is that we keep those segmentations pristine. They need to be randomized, they need to be pristine, and they need to not be mixed at any point in time. We can't judge the efficacy of the test without it. And it can be hard from a data management perspective for any like data nerds and media nerds listening to this podcast. It's challenging, but possible. And then, a lot of times my clients will ask, well, what if new people get added to the list? We can always rotate new people into the list. We just need to keep our clean split. We need to keep our randomized sample. We need to keep our same variables for our list. So list management, super important. Patience, really essential to success here. And just an understanding that if this works, or if I should say when this works, it's going to be so impactful that it will have been worth it to wait and do the test properly.
For admissions directors out there, just a one add-on to Jenna's point, if you do a time over time, so if you do before the test versus after the test, and that's all you rely on, it's going to be harder to control for seasonality. It's going to be harder to control for maybe my admissions rep, Bob, had an amazing big butt but month or 3 months, right? Or all this hiring, all the script changes we did in the same time period really paid off. You're going to look at all the things that happened and say, I don't know what actually had the biggest impact. I don't know what's actually worth continuing to go down. And you won't be able to measure that effectively to your board. When your board says, hey, I'm spending a couple $1,000 on this nurturing stuff, and I paid my agency $10,000 to create all this creative, was that worth it? And you're going to say, well, it improved, but you're not going to be able to say by how much and the actual ROI behind it. So that's, again, why the split. The other thing that I'll call out for the marketing people there is Google is going to default to expanding the list. All of the platforms are going to default to, hey, you're only targeting 2,000 people. We should really target 1 million people. So let me default to targeting to 1 million people, because Google, Meta, they're all sort of motivated to advertise to more people so that you spend more money, right? So just double check, triple check, QA, have somebody else look at it, look at spend later, but make sure you're not accidentally expanding those audiences. Make sure you're using the right audiences, like Jenna said, because the moment it doesn't happen, you've got to go to a different measurement strategy, because you sort of have to go back to the drawing board from what you had originally, which was the control and experiment split.
Yeah, can you tell Jeff and I have been burned by this before? It's
an easy mistake to make.
Every platform's going to tell you to do it, but the audience is the audience.
It's like when you do a remarketing campaign and it's like, are you sure you only want to market to people who've been to your website? Because I've got another 1 million people who would be interested in your product. No, that's different. That's somewhere else. Let me do that.
Send more money if you'd like.
No, thank you. And speaking of money too, the budgets on these are going to be pretty small. And so if you're a media buyer and you're estimating a budget, you can lean more conservative, more safely with the nurturing campaign because of the size of the audience and just because of the level of tactic that we need to reach these people. Like we said, we're not expanding the audience. We're not running these huge campaigns. It's very targeted. And then from a university side, when you're thinking marketing budget, where you're allocating a lot of your spend here is to the creative and build lift that it takes to make these things, but then also the measurement part. It's really important that we have a tool that can look at this all holistically. Like the more we can do in one environment, the better it is for this. And then the people hours that it takes to analyze the data is getting less because of different AI that we can use to help, but there also is some human intervention that is needed there. So from a university side, when you're budgeting, think a lot about the people time that it takes to make this happen. And from a media side, make sure you really understand the size of these audiences before you put together an estimate for budget.
It's a really good point. I think that ties into a little bit into something you said earlier around patience. I would imagine that you have to have some challenging conversations, and it's hard to be patient when you're spending a lot of money towards people time and not as much on media dollars, and it takes a little bit to see results. How do you navigate that? We talked a little bit about leading indicators of success, so I imagine this is where that conversation is going to go, but it's got to be hard for schools to commit to that and stay patient. How do you navigate those conversations?
It's hard, especially when you always have a deadline. There's always a time where we need a certain amount of students by. I think being proactive is one thing that really helps with it. These programs take time, and you need to have sufficient time to build them and start them. And then the other thing is having clear expectations. And Jeff loves to talk about this. We need to know how we know it's going to succeed, but we also need to know how it's going to fail. We need to be keeping ourselves accountable to not only success, but to failure through different checkpoints along the way. So we're not going to be able to tell you that a nurturing campaign is successful at 2 weeks. But what we can tell you is that it's spending appropriately, that the audience is engaging with it, and that they're taking the actions we want them to do. If we've been running this thing for 2 weeks and it's spent $1 and no one's clicked on it or no one's opened the email, there's probably something going on that we need to look into. So at a 2-week checkpoint, that's a really great indicator. At a 4-week checkpoint, that's going to be different. Not only are we interacting and we're spending, but we should see some conversations start to happen with these engaged leads. So that's going to be really valuable to get feedback from our friends in admissions, because this is not just a marketing effort. This is an admissions and marketing effort in the truest form. So that was what 4 weeks might look like. 6 weeks is going to be all that and more. We're going to start to tell some more leading indicators of time to convert maybe, and maybe a little bit of lift there. And then as we get into our true measurement period and we have enough significant data to make that lift, then we're holding ourselves accountable. We need to revisit our hypothesis. We need to make sure we're doing the lift that we said we were going to do. And if not, let's talk about how we're going to iterate. I know a lot of my clients and a lot of people across higher ed are like, it's not working, turn it off. We could do that for sure. And if it's bad enough, we should do that, and we should wreck it, and we should rebuild. I have seen that situation very few times. Most of the time it needs some tweaks, but it doesn't need completely wrecked and rebuilt. And that those tweaks can look like cadence. That's a really big one. The cadence not only of the messaging, but of the tactics. Maybe you're sending too many texts back to back, where you need to break that up and give display and social a little bit more of a time period. That can also look like audience split. It can look like spend. It can look like messaging. There's a lot of different ways to tweak, but that's the learn and grow part of test, learn, grow, right? We can't just stop. We need to know what succeeded and what failed so that we can iterate.
There was a lot there. And I'm just going to emphasize one point that she made, which was we need to know when we're successful, but we also need to know when we're going to fail. So like she said, I love talking about expectation setting in the very beginning of the test, especially for something as sensitive as, hey, we're trying to really impact enroll rates. Set expectations for what failure looks like and when you're going to pull the plug. So like you can talk to a client and say, if it looks bad enough, we're going to pull the plug. And if I were a client, I would say, okay, what does bad enough mean? Right? Like, what are we talking about here? And then you can say, hey, success looks like enroll rates increased X%, and you can calculate it based on how much they spent and then how much an enroll is worth. And then, what are the normal rates? And I got this many extra enrolls because I nurtured and it paid for itself, something like that, right? But for a failure metric, you might say enroll rates in the experiment dropped 25% for the last 2 weeks or while the test ran. Just as an example, a random example, you got to do the math. But it's just really important to call your shot in all of these things. And people always talk about KPI setting, like what is the most important metric we're going to see for did this work? But you also need early and for everybody to agree on what is a threshold for us knowing this is not working and we truly need to pull the plug or change something very different based off what's happening. Because it might do worse. It might look worse just from random chance for the first 2 weeks, right? So you might look at it and say the experiment has an enroll rate of 5% less than the control, but it's only been 2 weeks. So it's probably just a coincidence, right? So you need to make sure that you're setting, like I said, those expectations of this may look weird for the first little bit. And that's why we recommend a 3-month period. But if it looks weird to this extreme, that's when we're going to start making some pretty hard decisions about pulling the plug.
Yeah, and that accountability is so important on both sides. I always tell my team, I also tell my students, when you're talking to clients and you're working together, you're both working towards the same goal. So we have our expectations on our side, they have their expectations on their side. Those things need to align, and we need to both believe in the measurement portion of this. We both need to have metrics that we're holding ourselves accountable to and that we believe in. Because at the end of the day, data is data, tactics are tactics, but we are believing in the solutions that we're putting forth for potential students. And so if we both have something that we feel passionate about, that we're accountable to, this program is going to be so much more successful than if we're just saying, yeah, we're going to nurture some students, we're going to throw some texts and emails at them, we're going to measure, see if there's a lift, and at the end of the day, call it. This is something where it takes investment from a people perspective on both sides to make it successful.
Can't tell you how many, not for nurturing necessarily, but I can't tell you how many tests that Jenna and I have done where we came to the conversation. We didn't prepare to say this is what success looks like or failure looks like for this test with the client. We ran the test, everybody felt good, but we had a little bit of not 100% alignment on the measurement. We came back 4 weeks later and said, hey, we think this knocked it out of the park. Your CPLs dropped X%, your cost per enroll are better. And the client says, I actually don't agree because my cost per student is worse. Or that's all great, but click-through rate is way worse. And wouldn't you say the ad really needs to get a better click-through? And then you're you look like an idiot because A, not everybody's on the same page, and B, you're celebrating while the client is feeling miserable about what happened. So again, setting that expectation, and not just from the agency side, but the client side, work with your agency to make sure that you guys all agree on what success looks like here. And you're not assuming everybody's on the same page, but you have it like literally written down and you're revisiting it every time you talk about it.
Shared goals, shared vision. It's so important. And it might seem kind of silly, like you're sitting listening to a podcast, you're listening to these three random people talk about shared goals and vision. It sounds so businessy and so formal. But even if it's a tiny test, it really matters because that test is meaningful. We wouldn't do it if it weren't. We're not just random testing. We're only testing things that are meaningful. So even if it's small, it's meaningful. So client buy-in from the marketing side, but also from the admission side. We need admissions to be bought into this. This impacts them directly. And then on our side, media buy-in, creative buy-in, account buy-in, essential to success. You cannot skip that step because you could skip this, do everything else right, and at the end, it's going to be a failed test.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point just to tie this all together. Like, it's a lot. It's a big investment from your marketing team, your admissions team, your agency partner, if you have one. It's a lot from a strategy and tactics and messaging and segmentation, data measurement. And I think that's why we wanted to talk about it today, because I think, like we said at the beginning, a lot of people think it's just, let's just do some automated emails and some text messages. But to really do this right, it takes a big investment and a lot of brain power. This was really great. If this resonated with anybody listening out there, please hit us up at level.agency. We're always happy to hop on a discovery call and listen to what you're struggling with and talk about ways that we could potentially help. So if you made it this far, thanks for listening. Until next time, connect with us on LinkedIn, YouTube. We're always sharing insightful content around how to make your business, your school grow faster and smarter through performance marketing. And Jeff, Jenna, thank you so much again for joining. It's always great having you guys on.